And good day, everyone. I am Kristen Harper, Vice President of Public Policy and Engagement here at Child Trends. I am excited to welcome you to this presentation of Child Trends' groundbreaking study, recently featured in the New York Times, Lessons from a Historic Decline in Child Poverty. Our researchers will share with you today key highlights from the report, including the role that social safety net programs and the economy played in a historic 59% decline in child poverty over the last 25 years. We believe that this report underscores how reducing and even eliminating child poverty is achievable, and that our findings provide a roadmap for the work ahead. But before we get into content, a few housekeeping items. First, if you have any audio problems whatsoever, this webinar allows any participant to dial in rather than just rely on computer audio. Second, if you need technical support, please use the chat feature to alert my colleague, Megan Trainin, or send an email to mtrainin@childtrends.org. Last, we welcome your questions and your feedback, and we encourage you to submit them throughout the webinar using the chat feature. While we will not have a Q&A session during this webinar, we will respond to your questions and send them to all registrants after the webinar. So I want to start with a short note about Child Trends. For those of you who may not know us yet, Child Trends is the nation's leading nonpartisan research organization focused exclusively on improving the lives and prospects of children, youth, and their families. The study findings that you will be hearing today stem from Child Trends' commitment to improving child policy and programs, to achieving impact through research. This commitment focuses on promoting the well-being of children from low-income families and to promoting equity for children of color. I'll now present today's speakers as well as the run of show for today's webinar. Again, I'm your host, Kristen Harper, Vice President for Public Policy and Engagement here at Child Trends. And I am absolutely honored to be joined by Jason DeParle, who has graciously agreed to serve as our moderator for the discussions to come. Jason is a reporter for the New York Times and has written extensively about poverty and immigration. He is a recipient of the George Polk Award and a two-time finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. After Jason gives a few opening remarks, we'll hear directly from the lead authors of the study. I'm proud to introduce my colleague, Dr. Dana Thomson, a developmental psychologist here at Child Trends who studies the impact of poverty on child development, policies and practices to create more equitable access to economic mobility, and the conditions that support child and family well-being. I'm also pleased to introduce Dr. Renee Ryberg, a social demographer who co-leads Child Trends' work on child poverty with Dr. Thomson. Dr. Ryberg studies the intersection of poverty and education with the goal of creating equitable environments to help children and youth thrive throughout their education and into adulthood. After a brief discussion between Jason and the report authors, we will conclude this afternoon's webinar with our distinguished panel of state and federal human services officials. We are honored to have with us two state officials, including from Oklahoma, the Secretary of Human Services, Justin Brown; from Minnesota, the Deputy Assistant Commissioner for Children and Families, Barty Wahi. And we are grateful to have with us Assistant Secretary January Contreras, who leads the Administration for Children and Families within the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And with that review of our agenda and our speakers, I will turn it over to Jason.
Thank you, Kristen. When I started covering low-income Americans a generation ago, it was the rare day that I didn't hear someone highlight a dismal fact, that nearly 1 child in 4 lived in poverty. The numbers rose and fell with the economy, but not by a lot. In 1982, the second year of Ronald Reagan's presidency, the official child poverty rate was 22%. In 1993, Bill Clinton's first year in office, it was 23%, essentially unchanged from 3 decades earlier when the president was John F. Kennedy. Another soundbite was common on the poverty beat. We fought a war on poverty and poverty won. Ronald Reagan's famous formulation, reflected the pessimism that surrounded the poverty debate and also reinforced it. Taken together, the statistics and the quip conveyed a profound sense of defeat. The United States had the highest child poverty rates in the industrialized world, and many Americans, including its leaders, felt there was little the country could do. We're here today to discuss a very different story. From 1993 to 2019, child poverty in the United States fell nearly 60%. Let me say that again, since I never thought I would have the chance. Over the past generation, child poverty has fallen nearly 60%. It's fallen in every state, by 72% in Oklahoma, by 76% in Minnesota, 2 states we'll soon hear more about. It's fallen by roughly the same degree among children who are Black, white, Latino, and Asian, among those living with one parent or two, and among those living in Native or immigrant households. Deep poverty, especially severe deprivation, fell nearly as much. These are pre-pandemic numbers. With the outpouring of temporary aid over the last 2 years, child poverty, which had already fallen 60%, fell another 60%. The country's work isn't done. Child poverty remains a blight, and it often inflicts lifelong harm. As of 2019, more than 8 million children remained poor, more than 11%. Black children and Latino children remain about 3 times as likely as white children to be poor, and poverty is only one measure of hardship. With the poverty line set low, about $29,000 a year for a family of 4 in a place with typical living costs, many children suffer deprivation without meeting the government's statistical definition of poverty. Nonetheless, if the country had the same child poverty rate as it did a generation ago, more than 12 million additional children would be poor. That's a population the size of Pennsylvania. As social scientists, the people at Child Trends tend to be reserved in their choice of adjectives. So you know something's up when they start a report by describing the trend as unprecedented, remarkable, and astounding. It is indeed a remarkable story, and here to say more about it is Dr. Dana Thomson.
Thank you so much, Jason, for that great introduction, and good afternoon to everyone. I'm going to give Renee a moment here to pull up our slides. And I'll start just by saying that Renee and I are really thrilled to be here today to share with you some of the lessons that we learned from our analysis of this historic decline in child poverty. Before we begin, we would like to acknowledge that our work builds extensively on existing data and research. So we want to, in particular, thank the Census Bureau and Columbia University Center on Poverty and Social Policy, who developed and made publicly available the data sets that made this analysis possible in the first place. We also explicitly build on the National Academy of Sciences Roadmap to Reducing Child Poverty, as well as important work by Dolores Acevedo Garcia, Regina Baker, Liana Fox, Hilary Hoynes, Marianne Page, Ann Huff Stevens, and Chris Weimer. Next slide, please, Renee. Thank you. So our country, as Jason said, has seen a really remarkable decline in child poverty over the past 25 years. In this graph, we're looking at the rates of child poverty since 1967 using the anchored historical supplemental poverty measure. The gray bars in this graph represent times of economic recession. And I want to draw your attention to the right half of the graph where the decline happened. In 1993, more than 1 in 4 kids in the US lived in poverty. And in 2019, we reduced that to roughly 1 in 10 kids. And this represents a decline of 59%. As Jason said, we see a similar decline for deep poverty, which is the number of children and families living at less than half the poverty threshold or on less than about $15,000 a year for a family of 4. And as you can see, the right-hand side of this graph looks very different from the left-hand side. Not only is the extent of this decline unprecedented in the history of poverty measurement in the US, but it's also clear that something has really shifted in the landscape of child poverty. And our team set out to understand the full constellation of influences that led to this decline. And we did this in the hope that the lessons we learned along the way could help policymakers be better able to sustain and accelerate the progress that we've made. So we set out to answer the following three questions. First, what led to the remarkable decline in child poverty? And specifically, we looked at three major types of factors that shape the landscape of child poverty: economic and labor market factors, demographic changes, and policy shifts. The second question we set out to answer was, did all groups of children experience a similar decline in poverty? And finally, we asked, for which children has the social safety net worked, and who has it left behind? So without further ado, let's move on to what we found. The overarching story of what we found is a positive one. It's a story of success, but it's also a story with very important caveats. And we'll explain in this presentation all of the good news as well as the work that's left to be done. First, we looked at how economic factors shape this decline in child poverty, and we found that a healthy economy was an important and very necessary contributor to the decline in child poverty, but alone, it was not sufficient. In total, we examined 5 different state-level economic factors: changes in unemployment rates, single mother labor force participation, state minimum wages, median wages, and GDP per capita. We found that 3 were significantly associated with the decline in child poverty. Lower unemployment or a tighter labor market explained 18% of the total decline in child poverty during the time period we were studying, and increases in single mother labor force participation and state minimum wages explained 9% and 7% of the decline, respectively. We also found growth in median wages and GDP, and while this economic growth may have benefited families at higher income levels, they were not associated with reductions in the rates of child poverty. So together, these 3 factors, lower unemployment, increases in single mother labor force participation, and increases in state minimum wages, explained about 33% of the decline in child poverty and about 41% of the decline in deep poverty. This still leaves quite a bit left to be explained by other factors. So we also looked at demographic changes and found that as a whole, demographic shifts did not contribute to the decline in child poverty. They were, however, related to the decline in child deep poverty, and in a pretty big way. So I just told you that demographic factors did not contribute to the decline, but I'm going to pause for a moment to talk about why. There were actually some demographic factors that did make a small contribution to the decline. These are on the left-hand side of the screen. So namely, small increases in the share of children living in 2-parent families and small decreases in the share of Black children whose families face workplace and other forms of discrimination were each associated with declines in child poverty. But we also found that there were some factors that operated in the opposite direction, which is to say that everything else being equal, they would have actually pushed poverty rates up. So specifically, increases in the share of children in Hispanic and immigrant families who also face occupational segregation and discriminatory policies and practices were associated with increases in child poverty rates. And these countervailing factors overpowered the demographic factors, reducing poverty rates, which led us to the conclusion that if it weren't for the systemic barriers that an increasing share of our population are experiencing, then child poverty would have actually declined even more. So we see a somewhat different story for deep poverty, and here I'm just going to note the differences. First, the changes in the share of Black children and Hispanic children were not associated with changes in deep poverty. However, as we see on the right-hand side of the screen, increases in the share of children in immigrant families are still playing a role. So systemic barriers, and specifically those faced by immigrant families, are also inhibiting further declines in child deep poverty rates. But we also found an additional factor associated with declines in child deep poverty. Namely, there was a large 72% decline in teen birth rates over this time period. And while the relationship between teen birth rates and poverty is quite complex, the decline in teen birth rates was associated with about 52% of the overall decline in child deep poverty. So we've looked at the role of economic factors and the role of demographic factors on child poverty, and I'm going to turn it over to Renee to talk about the role of the social safety net.
Thanks, Dana. So thinking broadly about the social safety net, we've seen large growth in its role in protecting children from living in poverty over the past 25 years. And that growth in particular was responsible for much of the decline in child poverty. This graph illustrates that growth in the social safety net. The blue line is the actual child poverty rate as measured by the supplemental poverty measure. The purple line is a counterfactual, what child poverty rates would have been without the social safety net. So you can think of the gap between these two lines as the role that the social safety net plays in reducing poverty. In 1993, these lines were fairly close together. The social safety net played a modest role in reducing child poverty. It reduced child poverty by 9%, protecting 2 million kids from living in poverty. By 2019, the social safety net's role had grown. There's a much wider gap between the two lines. In 2019, the social safety net reduced poverty by 44% and protected 6.5 million children from living in poverty. So the number of children protected from poverty by the social safety net more than tripled between 1993 and 2019. Let's dive a little deeper into the social safety net. The programs that we examined are listed here along the x-axis. They include a wide range of programs from refundable tax credits, such as the Earned Income Tax Credit on the left, to in-kind supports, such as SNAP and housing assistance, to cash assistance through TANF. The dark blue bars show each program's poverty reduction role in 1993, and the light blue bars show their role in 2019. As you can see, the composition of the social safety net changed fairly dramatically over the past 25 years. We see growth almost across the board with taller light blue bars than dark blue bars showing their role in 1993. This was especially true for the Earned Income Tax Credit. The exception to this pattern, though, is TANF. TANF was previously considered to be a critical cash assistance program for families who were out of work or unable to work, but its role has greatly diminished. Meanwhile, the role of the EITC, which is conditional on work, has greatly grown. All right, we just saw that the social safety net's role in reducing child poverty grew considerably over the past 25 years. But over the same period, the US has made little progress in strengthening the social safety net for children with the least resources, particularly those in deep poverty. So here again, we see what deep poverty rates were in blue and what they would have been without the social safety net in purple. You can see that the space between these two lines is huge. This indicates that the social safety net has consistently played an important role in protecting children from living in deep poverty. In 1993, the social safety net reduced deep child poverty by 62%. And in 2019, this was a similar reduction of 66%. So the social safety net has consistently been an important factor protecting kids from living in deep poverty. But its role has not grown very much at all. And this is in stark contrast to what we just saw with child poverty. Because its role has not grown, the social safety net was not a major factor in contributing to the decline in child poverty, deep child poverty over time. We also see changes in the composition of the social safety net with respect to protecting kids from deep poverty. The main change here is the huge decrease in the role of AFDC and TANF. In 1993, AFDC was the single program protecting the most children from deep poverty, and now it's a pretty minor factor. We did see some growth in other programs, though, which helped to fill this gap. Notably, Social Security saw the largest increase in deep poverty in its reduction role. In 2019, Social Security was the largest contributor to deep poverty reduction, followed by SNAP. All right, I'm going to shift gears a little bit now to answer our second question, which was, did all groups of children experience a similar decline in poverty? And what we found here was remarkable, part of the success story that Dana mentioned. From 1993 to 2019, child poverty rates declined at similar rates for nearly all subgroups of children. So whether we looked by family immigration status, by child race and ethnicity, or by family structure, we see remarkably similar declines in child poverty across the board. However, this means that disparities between these groups persisted. And this graph illustrates those disparities in 1993. So in 1993, children in immigrant families were 1.7 times as likely to live in poverty as children in non-immigrant families. Asian, Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander children were about 1.5 times as likely to live in poverty as white children. And Black children, Hispanic children, and children in single-parent families were nearly 3 times as likely to live in poverty as their peers. If we fast forward to 2019, we see nearly identical disparities by family immigration status, by child race and ethnicity, and by family structure. So despite the historic decline in child poverty we've been describing, disparities in who is likely to experience that poverty have not budged. All right, and finally, to answer our third question, we looked at how well the social safety net works for these different groups of children. We found that the role of the social safety net in reducing child poverty grew over the past 25 years for nearly every subgroup, but that it does not work equally well for all children. Specifically, we found that the social safety net tends to work better for children in non-immigrant families than for children in immigrant families. It tends to work better for Black and white children than for Asian, Hawaiian, Pacific Islander children and Hispanic children. And it tends to work better for children with stably employed parents than children without a stably employed parent. You may notice here that many of the groups on the right for whom the social safety net works less well are the same groups of children that are at elevated risks of living in poverty. The social safety net actually makes existing disparities in child poverty worse by family immigration status, for some racial and ethnic groups, and by parental employment stability. Let me pause and say that again. The existing social safety net exacerbates existing disparities in who experiences child poverty. Okay, so to summarize, what we've found in this historic reduction in child poverty is a remarkable success story, but it's also one with very important caveats. Our findings lead us to believe that child poverty is solvable. We know that both a strong economy and a strong social safety net are important. We're also encouraged to find evidence that public policies can and do have considerable impact on the lives of children. We know a lot about what works for whom and what does not. But our nation's work to protect children from poverty is not over. Millions of children still grow up in poverty. And we found that existing policies affect children in different situations with varying degrees of success, in some cases making disparities worse. So to continue the success story and help eliminate the caveats, Dana and I will conclude with 5 policy recommendations. I'll cover the first 2, which have to do with ways to improve our social safety net. And then I'll turn it over to Dana to close us out with 3 policy recommendations related to broader root causes of poverty. First, we recommend that social safety net programs are recrafted to prioritize child needs. One important way to do this is by determining eligibility based on child needs rather than their parents' characteristics, such as their immigration status or work status. Second, we recommend that administrative barriers to the social safety net are eased. Easing administrative burdens will help reduce child poverty by making supports easier to access. And these changes may be particularly helpful in mitigating the persistent disparities that we've seen between subgroups of children.
Third, we recommend policies that boost the economy and support stable employment and more robust female labor force participation. These can take the shape of fair labor markets, higher minimum wages, and importantly, affordable and accessible childcare. In other words, we need to make work work as a sustainable way for parents to support their families. Fourth, one of our findings for deep poverty was that the decline in teen birth rates were associated with a large share of the reduction in child deep poverty. We therefore recommend efforts to maintain these low teen birth rates by increasing investment in evidence-based teen pregnancy prevention strategies, as well as safeguarding adolescents' access to contraception and safe abortion, the latter of which was endangered by the Dobbs decision by the Supreme Court earlier this year. And finally, based on our findings around two-parent families, we recommend promoting the economic, social, and caregiving benefits that families, including extended families, bring to children and their parents. Such benefits include not just economic resources, but also logistical, emotional, and caregiving support. Policies that support family, such as family leave and flexible work scheduling, can provide adults with greater opportunities and resources to support the children in their lives. Furthermore, we recommend reforming policies that undermine the consistent presence of stable caregivers in the lives of children. For example, child welfare agencies have a powerful influence over family stability, and many states' definitions of neglect include a factor linked to low income, such as inadequate food, clothing, and shelter. And this connection between poverty and neglect can lead to the surveillance of families with fewer resources and the separation of children from their families. So we go further into each of our policy recommendations in the report, and we hope you will take a look there as well. Many thanks, and Jason, we look forward to your questions and a rich discussion.
Thanks, Dana. As you know, I have a lot of questions. One of the things that really leapt out to me about the patterns that you found was that child poverty did not rise during recessions. I think that's remarkable in and of itself, and it's particularly meaningful if you have the historic perspective of the debate around welfare laws in the 1990s. The concern was that in abolishing the entitlement to cash aid, children would be especially vulnerable when the economy went bad, that we're building a safety net for good times, that programs that supported and rewarded work like the EITC would work well when there was work and would not when there wasn't. You found that actually the safety net post 96, was doing a better job than it was before the 90s, before the welfare laws were changed. So two things: tell us what you found, and then give us an interpretation. What happened in subsequent recessions, and then why?
Yeah, so just to acknowledge again that the concern that you mentioned was that as we shifted to programs that were conditional on work, then when we hit a recession and large numbers of families lost jobs, the safety net, to the extent it was work dependent, would actually not protect these families who are now out of work.
That was the fear.
Yeah. So as you said, that's not what happened. What we saw was that child poverty rates were actually more likely to increase during economic recessions prior to the 1990s compared to after. So prior to the 1990s, child poverty rates went up and down during recession, up during recessions, down during economic booms. And after the 90s, child poverty rates continued to go down during these economic booms, but were actually relatively stable during recessions. And in terms of interpretation, I would say that that's in large part because the social safety net has better protected families during these economic downturns in more recent years. And there's probably two reasons for that. One is that during major economic recessions, so for example, the Great Recession and more recently during COVID, we've implemented temporary measures to provide economic support to a much broader range of families, so that the administration has actually made a policy choice to expand the social safety net during a time when large number of families were experiencing hardship. And I would say the second reason is that the social safety net is comprised of a range of programs. Some, as you mentioned, like the EITC, are conditional on work, but a large number of which are not. And many of these latter programs, like unemployment insurance and SNAP, actually automatically expand during economic downturns as more people become eligible for them.
So two reasons why the safety net performed better in recessions. One, that policymakers responded with temporary aid, particularly during the pandemic, but also during the Great Recession. And two, the safety net itself was less tied up in the economic cycle than it seemed.
That's exactly right.
There were more counter-cyclical elements to it.
Exactly right. Yep.
Name a couple of those.
So, as I said, unemployment insurance will expand during economic recessions, and that is intended for workers who are out of work. Similarly, SNAP has expanded quite a bit during economic downturns, as well as more people become eligible for it, and during these temporary measures that we've implemented during recessions.
There's a huge growth in tax credits during this period of time. The amount that a low-wage worker with children can collect doubled or tripled over this period of time. I think we tend to think of that as being something that works during strong economies, but not in weak economies. Is it possible that it worked also during the downturns, in that people typically don't stop working entirely for a year? So even if their earnings fall, they're still getting something from the tax credits, and in fact, they might even be getting more than they got before if their earnings fall. So did the tax credits play a larger compensatory role than?
So that's a really interesting point. We did see in our analysis some evidence that the EITC, the role of the EITC did expand a little bit, not as much as these other programs I've just named, but did expand a little bit during economic recessions. And I think the reason for that is exactly what you just said, that in large part, most families were not experiencing complete job loss with zero earnings over the course of a year. So that could be for a number of reasons. They experienced a temporary layoff, or one member of the family experienced a layoff and was still able to rely on work. They experienced a loss of income, and that loss of income may have made them eligible for more benefits in terms of the EITC.
Thank you, Renee. I have a similar historical perspective question for you. So, having covered the welfare debate in the 1990s, lived through it, one fear was that the safety net wouldn't work during times of recession. The other is that the most disadvantaged poor people would be particularly hurt. If you think about the population of poor families on a continuum, the concern was, well, maybe those who were most healthy, most educated, had the most access to childcare or transportation maybe they would be able to get jobs and then have the benefit of the tax credits and rise up, but that the bottom half would be worse off. You didn't find that. You found that deep poverty fell almost as much as regular poverty. You had presented a different set of explanations. I thought you presented them with a little bit of a negative light, like the safety net didn't do as much for deep poverty as it did for regular poverty. That may be true. I still find it astonishing that deep poverty fell by half. I think if you rolled back the tape to the mid-1990s and said that was how what you were going to find, and most people would have seen that as good news. So tell us what you found in deep poverty, what you think is good about it, and why you highlight the concerns you did.
Sure. There is an exception to this pattern, which if I don't get to it, bring me back there at the end. So yeah, we did find that deep poverty fell by more than half, 56% over the same time period. And by deep poverty in particular, we mean families with resources at less than half of the poverty threshold. So that's between the at most $15,000 a year for a family of 4. Really not enough for a family to meet their basic needs. And the social safety net is important, really important in protecting kids from deep poverty in any given year, but it's not part of the story of the decline because it didn't expand over time for these kids. What we did find that was important were economic factors and demographic factors. In terms of economic factors, it's the same factors that were important for the poverty reduction. It's more single moms in the labor market, higher minimum wages, and tighter labor market, less unemployment. Together, those explained about 40% of this decline in deep child poverty. On the flip side, for demographic factors, we saw a small role for an increase in kids living in two-parent families, but that was pretty small. The major demographic change here was a huge decrease in teen birth rates over the past 25 years. Teen birth rates have fallen by nearly 3/4 since 1993, and this was associated with more than half of the decline in deep child poverty. So that's a very different story from what we saw for poverty. Like Dana said, it's really important to recognize that the relationship between deep child poverty and teen birth rates is messy. It's multi-directional, but there's a strong—
What do you mean by multi-directional?
Yeah, so you can kind of think of it cyclically, that a kid growing up in poverty is more likely to become a young parent, and a young parent has access to less resources and is likely to, is more likely for their kid to grow up in poverty as well. So it's a little bit of a chicken and an egg situation.
You don't know whether the decline in poverty caused the teen birth rate to fall, or the falling teen birth rate caused child poverty to fall.
Exactly. Yeah, we weren't able to disentangle that with our analyses here.
But to go back to what you're saying about the safety net, it's the safety net you're not saying the safety net did less to help reduce deep poverty. You're just saying it didn't increase as it did for regular poverty.
Exactly. Its role was remarkable.
More or less the same.
Yeah, and the nuance there that I wanted to add is something that we haven't highlighted too much from our report, but I think is a really important finding. So I said that child poverty rates have declined at similar rates for nearly every group. The exception here is deep child poverty rates for children without stably employed parents have not fallen nearly as much. So these shifts in the social safety net really left behind kids whose parents are not stably employed for whatever reason.
You earlier had a slide up that showed the 10 programs you all looked at and the change in their anti-poverty impact then and now. I wanted to ask you about the nature of those programs. If there's one conceptual frame for the way we think about social policy in the last 25 years, it's been a move towards supporting families who work and away from unconditional aid. So people who didn't work, we tend to think of as, for whatever reason, they're not working, they can't work, they can't find work, they don't have the childcare, whatever the reasons are, we tend to think they're getting less support, and people who are working are getting more support, particularly classically from tax credits. You found a more complicated pattern than that, which was interesting to me because I've probably written dozens of times that we've moved towards the so-called work-based safety net, but some of the programs that you found, and part of that was true, you found the tax credits in particular, the earned income tax credit cut child poverty by 22%, but then you also found big child poverty impacts of Social Security, which doesn't have a immediate work test of people worked in the past, but not currently. Disability programs, SNAP, school meals, all those other things don't have a work-based component to it. So, Dana, how would you describe the safety net? Is it a work-based safety net? Is it a mix of this and that?
Yeah, I think I'd start by saying that many of these programs have actually been around for decades and were put into place by very different administrations to serve different goals. So you're right. What we're looking at is actually a kind of a patchwork of programs. And I think having this mix of programs is actually one of the strengths of the current safety net. So as you said, the EITC, which is conditional on work, has been shown to be one of our most effective longstanding programs for reducing child poverty, and it plays a certain role. It's important because it helps to make work work for families by boosting wages that are otherwise too low to support a family. And there's evidence that outside of our own work that shows that the EITC pulls parents into the workforce by making work pay. But then we have a whole set of other programs, many of which are not conditional on working at any given moment in time. So as you said, programs like Social Security, also unemployment insurance, SNAP, national school lunch programs, and these programs serve another purpose, also a very important purpose, and that's really, to be there for families to fall back on when they face temporary setbacks or longer term work instability due to things like chronic health issues.
I can imagine an optimistic interpretation of this trend being that somehow or another, the U.S. has hit on the right mix of work incentives and protections for those who don't work. And we've got a jumble of programs that maybe accidentally stumbled into a good mix that offers sort of maximum protections. The other interpretation would be we continue to have a jumble of unrelated programs that maybe worked okay in the conditions of 2019, but still leave lots of people falling through the cracks and may continue to do so in the future. So on that continuum, do you locate yourself in somewhere along there?
I would say, again, it's a mix. So I would say some of these programs, their poverty reduction role grew over this time period based on very intentional policy decisions to increase benefits or expand reach. So the EITC is a good example of a program where we've seen the benefits increase. The National School Lunch Program is a good example of a program that has intentionally expanded reach through community eligibility. Other programs, as I mentioned earlier, naturally expand and contract based on need, and others have expanded in really what I would say are unexpected ways. So it could be because technological advances made programs easier to use, and an example of that is the shift from food stamps to EBT cards, electronic benefit transfer cards, or because of shifts in living arrangements. So more children are living with grandparents, and because the household is benefiting from the Social Security benefits, children are also benefiting from those Social Security benefits. So
just listening to you describe all these programs, 10 programs you looked at, each one has multiple components, serves a variety of subpopulations. We tend to think of that system as being like a mess. It's a patchwork, it's a jumble, it's these words we use for it. But you found its miscellaneous nature of conflicting rules, constituencies, aims, actually to be a kind of strength that it caught a lot of people.
Yeah, I think
that was of interest to me. I think
one of my takeaways, even in doing this analysis and in discussions with you, is that kind of patchwork is actually its strength, because there's actually no one-size-fits-all solution. The experience of poverty is not uniform, and we really do need a mix of programs that are designed to address very different situations.
I would love to beat that horse some more, but it's probably mostly of interest to me. And I see from our audience has some questions about another important topic we discussed at length, which was how well the safety net is serving immigrants. So we've got like 2 minutes left before we move on to our next panel. Dana or Renee, would you like to talk about that?
Sure, I'll do my best to give a quick answer. So this is a super important question. A huge number of our children are living in immigrant families. 1 in 4 kids in the US lives with at least one parent who was not born in the US. So this is a wide-reaching problem because those families face systemic barriers both in accessing the full benefits of the labor market and the social safety net. And because of that, these children have elevated risks of living in poverty. Thinking specifically about the social safety net, because of time constraints, children in immigrant families are explicitly excluded from large parts of our social safety net. And just to give one example of the EITC, the largest program protecting kids from poverty.
Let me interrupt real quick. Are you talking about legal immigrants or unauthorized immigrants or both?
Both. In this case, both. So the EITC requires every member in the household to have a social security number for anyone to benefit. So a US born citizen child whose parents are in the country legally, maybe one is a US citizen, one is not, and working with an I-10, no one in the household then can benefit from the EITC.
You found there were barriers to access not only among undocumented immigrants, which most people would assume, but also among legal immigrants, in part because of program design, because they were designed not to serve waiting periods, for instance, for 5 years before legal immigrants, and in part for cultural reasons, that language barriers or other reasons?
Yes, there's some explicit exclusion criteria where these decisions were made to exclude large groups of our population from eligibility. There are also additional layers of administrative burden that immigrant families may face. For example, it may be hard to find application materials in a language other than English.
It's a good sign when we have more questions coming in on our chat than we can address. So thank you both for that. I think it's time to move on to our next panel. Thanks.
Thank you, Jason.
Hi, everybody. We're back. We have everybody on screen. Thank you all for making time as human services administrators who have immediate and weighty obligations to low-income families to give your own perspectives. You know, when we were finding this data, I went out at some point to start interviewing families, and I wondered if what we were finding on paper would match up with what they felt and saw in their own lives. I was pleased to see to a large extent it did, but I wanted to ask you, in your own work, does this do you know, the study portrays a safety net that does much to supplement the earnings of low-income families. Does that reflect your experience? Maybe we should start with Assistant Secretary Contreras and go from there.
Thanks, Jason. You know, I had the benefit of the last 8 years prior to coming to this role of leading a legal aid organization and representing a lot of young parents. And many of them immigrant, undocumented, but in process of obtaining some kind of path. A lot of young parents who were coming out of the foster care system, in a domestic violence shelter, possibly in a homeless program. And I'll say mostly what I saw is it's still hard for them. It's still hard for them to get through day by day. But there is this increasing, I think, sort of solidarity among service providers, where I think more resources are being shared among, you know, crossing some of those silos. And that's a really important part of, you know, just letting families know what are all the resources that are there. But, you know, there's no question, the cash assistance that came out of tax credits, out of unemployment, stimulus checks, you know, for our young parents, those made all the difference. It allowed them to have a stable home. It allowed for some of them to, you know, buy a car. It really, you know, not a nice car, but something to get, you know, themselves and their kids around. So there's no question to me that cash assistance that really gave the power to the families to spend it on their kids the way that they knew they needed to, really did make a difference.
I wanted to talk about the difference between cash and in-kind assistance. So let's put that on hold for just a second. Secretary Brown, what do you see in your day-to-day work about the importance of the safety net for low-income families?
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to be here. What really resonated to me about the study was sort of the idea that those living in experiencing homelessness or experiencing deep poverty didn't participate at the same level as those sort of the working poor component or segment of the research study. And I think that's what we see here, and somewhat of what we see across the country, although I can't speak for other states, is that there is a segment that has been a little bit left behind. There's improvement, but not the same level of improvement. And I think it's incumbent upon systems like ours to really transition with the understanding of the idea that the outcomes of the policy changes in prior periods have been effective, and we can see that through the research now. And by the way, I think this is going to be a transformative piece of research for generations to come. But we now have this understanding that this transition in programs worked, and it is my opinion and the opinion here in Oklahoma that we have to move away from transaction sum in these big systems and towards relationship. And that's where I'd spend a lot of time talking, because those living in deep poverty really require us to know them at a personal and family level to resolve the barriers that exist for them in those in their journeys. And so again, I see we definitely see the difference between those living sort of at or around the poverty line and the improvement there, sort of outpacing the improvement of those living in deep poverty. And to me, the solution is relationship and a custom safety net that addresses specific needs of individuals. I'm tempted to ask follow-up questions. I want to hear more about how you would do that, but let me ask Commissioner Wahi to bring Minnesota into the picture in terms of what you're seeing of the impact of the safety net.
Well, I think in the study you can see that Minnesota actually fares pretty well. We are the safety net that has been put in place, both through federal partnership, but I think then also state investment has had an impact on children and families here in Minnesota. I think, and so, I mean, I think that that's fantastic news. To Secretary Brown's point, like, I think it is helpful to be able to point to these elements that work. I was also struck by sort of the diversity of programs, and also the fact that because it feels like a patchwork, there may be some power in the patchwork, if you will. I
like that phrase.
Right, there's the phrase.
When I was writing, I needed that.
You're welcome. But I think that one of the things that I am concerned about, and we are here in Minnesota, is I think the exacerbation of disparities, right? That is actually also at play too. Here in Minnesota, we have deep disparities based on race and ethnicity, and particularly for certainly immigrant families who are unable to access certain programs. But I think if we look at our American Indian population and our Black population as well, just to give you a little bit of context about Minnesota, while we're happy to see our ability to make progress highlighted, for an American Indian family in 2019, the average median income was $34,000 a year. For Black Minnesotans, it was $41,000 a year. For whites, it was $108,000 a year. So I just think, we have to recognize the history and the systemic context that we are in. And then I think to Secretary Brown's point, if we're going to, I think, really engage or enter into the next stage of poverty mitigation, and then, dare we say it, economic mobility for those who are at the lowest end of the income spectrum, we're going to have to talk to folks. We're going to have to understand what it means, right? So I think those are some of the things that I am reflecting on with this report and its impact on Minnesota.
There were two important programmatic areas that the report really didn't cover. One is healthcare and the other is childcare. There's reasons they didn't cover it is because the Census Bureau doesn't count those things when it's in any direct way when it's calculating poverty. So this is a report about poverty measure. I'm particularly interested in hearing what emphasis you all would place on the importance of childcare and where it stands in the current recovery. Secretary Brown, I see you're nodding your head. Why don't you go first?
Well, I think the last couple of years have truly illustrated the incredible importance of childcare specifically. That's one of the divisions here that we operate at Oklahoma Department of Human Services. And, I think the awareness from a public perception perspective that childcare isn't daycare, there is incredible opportunities for quality, for building a generation, prepared to take on the transitions in life. But that also is economic development for some of these communities that are left behind. And it is impossible to overstate the importance of a very robust childcare system that is serving all of those in our communities. And again, it requires, I point to relationship all the time. And so the idea is building relationship to solve for these barriers, childcare, healthcare, all of these that exist for people working, but also for building the next generation of those prepared to take on the transitions in life.
Secretary Contreras, probably nobody in America has more direct responsibility for childcare and ability to move it in a good direction than you. Tell me about where it stands in ACF's priorities.
Yeah, I mean, we're just really glad that you asked that question because it certainly was, both of those, childcare and access to affordable healthcare, can't really be understated, even though, as you note, they're not particularly outlined in this report for the reasons you stated. At ACF, childcare is just a very high priority. To Secretary Brown's point, the last 2 years certainly showed us how important it is to keep a sustainable childcare provider network in place, and how difficult that is. So what you see out of ACF, what you've seen out of the Biden-Harris administration, out of Congress, is this very, robust support to make sure that we keep the childcare, sector in place, that we are supporting parents to make sure that it's affordable and that they have access. Again, I think both on the healthcare side and the childcare side, it's if parents are having to spend too much of their money on those items, it leaves them without that ability to pay for other things. It makes them make choices between their own home or living with someone else, or having a car or using public transportation. So they're important. And at ACF and at HHS and this administration, access to that affordable healthcare has been front and center. With the pandemic.
What would childcare cost for preschooler a year in a typical market? What are you talking about a parent having to pay if they don't have subsidized care and they're lucky enough to get it?
So, it depends on the market, but, the goal is that it would be a smaller percentage of every family's income in order to pay childcare, because it does, take up, it can take up a very large percentage. So the goal is we're decreasing what that percentage is, so that it doesn't leave families without other options, including the option of having to have a parent stay home. This study pointed out how important women in the workplace were. A lot of those are moms. And if childcare isn't there and accessible, then they're going to have to stay at home when the finances and the budget really just don't make it work.
Commissioner Wahi, tell me about childcare in your state.
Yeah, I would echo much of what Secretary Brown and Assistant Secretary Contreras said. Certainly the pandemic, I think, uplifted and highlighted a need, the real necessity of childcare to support our broader economy, right? And I think that, we definitely are seeing that. I think here in the state of Minnesota, it's twofold. How can, and the tension around maintaining affordability and then also just providing supports to that network of providers, and ensuring that, that group of providers are also, earning and living at a living wage as well, right? Childcare is no one's making any money off of childcare, right? As a former center provider myself, so I think that is the work that we are doing here in the state of Minnesota, and really taking some of the learnings that we have of programs we've stood up during the pandemic to provide additional supports to childcare providers to support increased access for families living in low-income households to really do that. But to the point of the report, how do you make work? Childcare isn't a critical piece of that.
I want to come back to something each of you said. You, Secretary Contreras, you started at the beginning by alluding to the difference between cash and in-kind benefits. Of course, that's a perpetual debate in Washington about whether to provide families with cash that they can use as they see fit and have the maximum flexibility, or provide a specific benefit like SNAP or a child care voucher or health insurance, which guarantees that a specific need would be met. I'm interested in what types of programs, either at the state level or federal level or state or local level, have you found to be particularly effective in reducing child poverty, and how do you think about the tension between those two ways of providing assistance? Secretary Contreras, you want to go first? You had that on your mind from the beginning.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think, what we've seen and what the study speaks to is that the unemployment compensation, the tax credits, those are things that really help families. It's that difference of living day by day, and maybe you live week by week instead. I mean, that's the reality for a lot of families. And that's why so many of us are in this work. I think other things that come into play from, at least from ACF and our partners, our USDA partners, which, have had a lot of love in this conversation already, they came through and they've really come through with increased benefits in SNAP, with the school lunches. We just had the White House conference on hunger, nutrition, and health, where we heard President Biden say out loud, no child should go to bed hungry. And that's a goal that the administration has taken on. At ACF, you saw increased utility assistance as an example, something that everyone can agree with to help people pay their energy bills. A new program was created at ACF, LIWAP, which is helping people pay their water bills. So these are kind of things where I think you see increased recognition that families, when they're struggling, something needs to be there to help them make less difficult choices. And those are things that, are important to be adding into, as what we see is this sort of puzzle of pieces coming together that, really ends up helping families and helping them move forward a little bit.
Secretary Brown, when I was interviewing families in West Virginia, one of the women that I talked to who had gotten the earned income tax credit said she would prepay a year's worth of after-school babysitting. It was about $2,000. She'd pay it every year as soon as she got her money, just so she would know that if the car broke down, she wouldn't fix the car and lose her job because she couldn't pay for childcare. So I don't know if that's a story about the value of the flexibility of cash assistance, or whether the point of the moral of the story is the need for childcare, or I suppose you could interpret it in either way. But tell me, in your standpoint, how you think about those issues.
Well, that's an incredible story. I listened to the podcast on the daily and actually heard her voice, and it's wonderful to hear. I would tell you there are, of course, at least 50 different opinions on how to use cash assistance in these programs. And from my standpoint, the work that I try to do, and I think as a nation, the work that we need to do together, is identify what the outcomes are that we're trying to achieve. And I think we can all align around the concept of a reduction in child poverty. That seems pretty easy to do. And then allow states to be sort of the 50 different laboratories that exist in getting there. And I think if we can sort of build that system that allows for us to target the same things with different approaches, in a short period of time, we will understand what success looks like and what the proper ingredients are for that. It's certainly a mix of cash assistance in the right places. It's a mix of child care support and others. It's programs around teen pregnancy and family preservation and those sorts of things also. So there's just an incredible amount of ingredients. For us, as I've mentioned it a few times, the idea here is relationship with the people that we serve. And so that way, as we build sufficient data surrounding these relationships, we can understand where strategic investments can occur in the lives of families, particularly around transitions in life, losing a job, having a child, those sorts of things may require different types of interventions in order to sort of reach or help the family reach the level of success that they're targeting. So while I don't believe there is any right answer for the role for cash assistance in an individual's life or a family's lives, because there is so much level of complexity, I do believe that there is a proper place for cash investment. And as we build systems that allow us to build relationship and know our families, we can really get to that space where we know what that proper intervention looks like.
Commissioner Wahi, one thing that struck me in talking to people about SNAP was how often they described its benefits in terms of their mental health or psychological health, or put slightly different, that how much they described the mental strain of being food insecure. That when I would ask them what they'd gone through, the first answer didn't tend to be about somebody missing meals for being hungry. It tended to be about worrying all the time, getting up in the morning, worrying, how am I going to get that day's meal? So even when they were able to feed their children, it was a mental tax on them. Do you find that in your work? Talk a little bit about the mental strain the families you work with are under.
Right. So, I think poverty isn't just a set of numbers, right? It is a state, it is also, it has implications on one's state of being, right? And in 2020, actually, the Department of Human Services here in Minnesota released a report that really looked at the health implications of deep poverty. I invite those to take a look at that report, because we actually talked to real people in the community about what it felt like to struggle with deep poverty, right? And I think that I don't think you can underestimate how much there is an immense amount of insecurity and uncertainty when one is living at the lowest ends of the sort of economic spectrum, right? And so when we think about public programs and their ability to not only just provide a meal, provide a voucher for housing, to provide cash supports, right? It's sort of all of these in total, and how they create greater peace of mind. That's what, in all honesty, that's what resources do for people who are at the upper end. It creates a greater margin of error, right? You have more room to breathe, to understand what your options are. When you are living with margins that tight, there is just not a lot of room for variability or error. And I think, one of the things that I really appreciated about not only the report that the Department of Human Services here in Minnesota did on deep poverty and its implications on health, because we were really looking at the intersection of two things or more. But I guess I would also highlight the opportunity that report gave us to think about, how do we, who are designing, human services programs, policies, eligibility requirements, all of the things, how do we add to the volatility of that kind of insecurity, and really has, I think, shaped some of the policy proposals that we are currently working on here at the state, how we're thinking, how we thought about some of the things that we were seeing during the pandemic, certainly, right? Because I don't think it can be underestimated that when one is living with that kind of insecurity, the impact it has on a whole host of other measures of well-being at the child and at the family level.
You use the phrase, you can breathe. In my interviews, I talked to a Latino woman in Houston who used that exact phrase in Spanish. I don't speak Spanish, so I had to get it. She was using a Honduran idiom, and and I got it in Spanish. It was exactly that. I could breathe. And what it meant colloquial is, we can get by. I can breathe. I can get by. It planted in my ear, and I noticed as I was talking to other people how often that metaphor would be, we can breathe. I can imagine an unsympathetic taxpayer saying, why should I care if this or that person can breathe? I'm out here working 2 jobs myself to get by. Tell me what's at stake from the children's point of view. What happens if a child is growing up in a family with every family's got stress, but I'm talking about an extreme level of stress, an unhealthy level of stress. Secretary Contreras, you want to talk about that?
Sure. And I think, building off Commissioner Wahi's comments about, you can't separate any of this, right? It is more than numbers. From my perspective, just based on, the last 8 years in particular, I can tell you one thing is safety. When there are people who do not have options because financially they won't have a place to stay, they won't have a roof over their kids' heads, they won't have a meal to put on them, they won't, literally they have one stroller to walk them around town. Then, I have had many clients myself who I've served who have had to stay in very dangerous situations because they truly didn't see any options, because they didn't know how to, get childcare. And these are people who want to work. Boy, they want to, but, can't make those pieces work because of the financial pieces of that. And also for kids, even if they don't have that thing hanging over their head, although it's always, when you're living in poverty and in a very desperate situation, you and your kids are going to be at greater risk for violence, for exploitation. Those are just real things that exist in our country and across the world. Beyond that, it's also, the opportunities that they have. Kids feeling the stress of their parents, that you can't help it. You may be in a home that's very caring and loving, but economic stress, not knowing when you're going to be able to pay your bills, not knowing, can you ask this cousin to move in because you already outstayed your welcome with, this other cousin. Those are things that are very real. And when a parent feels stress, you can't help but for that child to also, adopt some of that stress. It just is what happens. And that doesn't go away.
On a bit of a personal note, I think some of my own focus on child poverty the last 4 or 5 years has been affected by the academic literature, the findings that of how important brain development is, and that early experiences of economic adversity aren't just bad in and of themselves, but carry lasting consequences. So when I think about, being a poverty reporter, there's never a shortage of things to write about, but it's one reason why I think at the paper we've chosen to highlight child poverty is because of its lasting effects. Secretary Brown, you mentioned your concern about the most disadvantaged, those left behind, and the need to engage them. Tell me a little bit more about how you go about doing that, and is there a programmatic access point? Does one program lead you to work with people? Is it a geographical thing, a place, a presence? How do you that everyone I think would agree with about the need to do that, and everybody would say, wow, it's a big challenge. So
I'll rewind for just a second on your question about sort of the taxpayer piece, the regular taxpayer thinking about poverty in these systems. I think we have to start to transition our narrative as a nation away from, and a lot of impact has been made already, but away from sort of this concept of supporting people who are living in poverty, and that's, well, okay, so transition. How about this? We can do 2 things at once. We can do the right thing for people, and we can also make the right fiduciary decisions for taxpayers at the same time. These strategies and policies that we can take and we can build from this report allow for us to look at these systems as an investment in families rather than just a support system. Although that's really important, it is the right thing and it feels good. It's also, as we move upstream, these systems allow for us to avoid expenses downstream in healthcare systems and criminal justice systems. Solving for poverty improves outcomes in all of those systems. So how you do that, to your point, from in Oklahoma, our perspective, you asked the question about that I refer to as the distribution model change for human services. The idea is that we do have effective systems, and this report illustrates that, but we're not great at getting the resources to the people where they are, when they need them in the proper amount. So we are rebuilding a distribution
Say
model.
a bit about the people. When you say getting the resources to the people, are you talking, I mean, put some color on that. Are you talking about people with mental health issues, drug issues, physical
all of those things? Yes, absolutely, all of those things. So we are looking at the people that we serve, not just as where they need to work. It is really the concept of family and career success plans. And the interventions required don't necessarily always start with day one with a job. The idea is we need to get people there, because work is the way out, and making work, as we've said a number of times, is the way out of poverty. But from a pragmatic perspective, there are people that we engage with every day with mental health concerns, mental illness, with substance abuse issues, that we've got to solve for those problems first. And the creation of family and career success plans allow for us to help folks navigate those more basic needs. That's needs for food and housing and those sorts of programs as a front door to a relationship where we can help make referrals and build.
So is TANF your programmatic lever then?
Absolutely. And the idea around modernizing TANF and modernizing work requirements to include those sorts of interventions around mental illness and food. And, every family is on their own journey in their own place. And we have to be practical in knowing that people may need some more basic interventions before they can get to work, but also align around the idea that family stability is critical and important. And again, this research shares that, but work and making work is also a fundamental element to exiting poverty. So we talk about the distribution model change, reaching those people where they are. We do that through really a wholesale change in the way we operate at the agency through deep embedded worker programs. Now you see agency employees embedded in homeless shelters, in schools, in law enforcement offices, hospitals all over the state of Oklahoma. We've developed a platform called Hope Centers, where we wrap resources around either youth development providers like Boys and Girls Clubs and urban leagues, or workforce programs where we solve for childcare, for food deserts, for mental health requirements. So
you're not talking about sitting in a TANF office and waiting for somebody to come in?
Absolutely not. We are moving from being one side of a transaction to being one side of a relationship. And you also have to marry that with digital tools that allow for you to do that at scale, and for people to navigate systems without having to actually walk in the door somewhere. So these are huge conversations, but I'll tell you, leaders in human services systems across the country, two of which I'm here with, understand the necessity of knowing the people we serve, listening to their voices, and building systems that meet them in wherever they are in their situation.
Commissioner Wahi, can you tell us more about what Minnesota does to try to reach the most disadvantaged?
Well, I mean, Secretary Brown said it really quite well. I mean, I think, we have to ask, and we have to be willing. I guess I would also just offer that I think one of the things that we learned through the report, I mean, we did actually a lot of qualitative and quantitative data, so we talked to a lot of folks, right? There is a quote in that report about somebody getting their tax refund and crying, right? Because it was suddenly childcare for the next year was possible. And so I think that, I think it really is about going to ask. And I guess I will say, just bringing it back to this particular report, right? I appreciated the recommendation of centering public programs around child need and less around the specific characteristics of a family or family composition, because I think it's an important reframing, right? And as we think about what conversation we have with our communities, right? that if we were to start that conversation from that place and really think about what designing would look like, I think we would enter into a different type of relationship that Secretary Brown is speaking of, right? That moves maybe further away from the transaction, although that's always part of it. But I think at a place of what is the shared outcome we seek for all of our children. And so, I mean, I think that in Minnesota, definitely under the leadership of our governor and our lieutenant governor, really thinking about what one Minnesota would look like, how we can really address the deep disparities that exist in our state and how that has to happen through relationship. And if our existing safety net is working, but maybe not impacting the longstanding disparities, that might be the pivot point we have to make, right? Where we are speaking to Black, Indigenous, Brown communities, immigrant communities, and folks in greater Minnesota where the geographic challenge, for example, I'm not sure about Oklahoma, but we have some deep geographic challenge in terms of serving our rural children. And I think getting out and starting to speak to what would really, now we know that these things can work, and maybe in a concerted way, again, power to the patchwork. And how do we start to really address and get to the deepest disparities that we are, and it's going to require us working with community, because we can't solve that problem alone.
Secretary Contreras, you oversee the patchwork. You're the sultan of the patchwork. How can you, from Washington, indirect with substantial but indirect authority over so many different programs, how do you think about trying to reach the most disadvantaged?
I'm definitely not a sultan, but work with 1,500 plus amazing people who care about this work every day, and our state partners, right? Our partners in states and tribes and territories. We've really focused on some key values that I think are important to your question, Jason. One is really, it's something that was spoken by all of the panelists here, but bringing in people with lived experience, prioritizing customer service. You asked at one point, does that mean sitting in a TANF office somewhere? We don't want that visual either. So, really trying to make sure that we are doing those things so that we understand what is the experience like to access services and resources that come through ACF, because we want those to improve. We have had a very heavy focus on prevention. Some of that mentioned here because prevention comes into play in so many ways, but you brought in, Jason, mental health. You can't extract that from anything else. Substance abuse, which overlaps a lot with poverty. Our ability to reach rural and tribal communities. Those are all things that we're very focused on in a prevention way, so that we can try to utilize resources, promote policies and best practices that, to the extent they can, try to help people avoid the sort of worst crises situations. And then I think, another factor there is this whole family approach of, what a parent experiences, a child experiences, kinship caregivers. How many grandparents out there are increasingly taking in their grandkids, and what are we doing to make sure the policies and reimbursement models that exist are fair and equitable to them? So that term equity is something that we've really tried to center and turn into action, so that we're really digging into the disparities that exist and holding ourselves accountable to really doing better.
Secretary Brown, you said something about, I'm paraphrasing, convincing taxpayers that their dollars were having some impact. I think that's one of the reasons I wanted to work on this study at any rate. Maybe I don't want to speak for Child Trends, but that may be part of them too. I think the patchwork is often described in purely disparaging terms as money wasted on a lot of disconnected programs. Child Trends data showed that the anti-poverty impact had grown from 9%, removing 9% of children from poverty a generation ago, to 45% today. do you think the voters in your community feel better about the safety net now than they might have a generation ago?
Well, that's a great question. I would tell you that the pandemic brought these issues closer to us, to those of us who don't live at the poverty level or around the poverty level than we had ever been before. Many times now our neighbors recently had lost jobs, were sort of struggling to make ends meet. And so I think that the pandemic brought this issue closer to home. And so I would say that there is definitely more of a narrative of the understanding that these systems are intending to have outcomes that are positive for communities and positive for taxpayers. I don't know yet that we have been able to tie data to that. And I think that's sort of the next big stage for lots of us, is building technology and a physical and digital distribution model that allows for us to follow large groups of families and see where these strategic interventions really impact outcomes. And so I definitely think the population's general population, the landscape is open to the understanding that this is an investment, because it's pretty easy to see now that the worst outcomes that occur in our communities in again, I mentioned earlier, but criminal justice and education and health and all of these programs can all tie back to poverty. And if we can make impact upstream, hopefully we can make impact downstream, which is significantly more expensive.
I'll put an exclamation point on your statement just by noting that the National Academy of Sciences report estimates that something like $1 trillion a year of human services costs can be traced back to child poverty. So it is a big bill that we all pay, and of course nobody pays it more than low-income families themselves. Thank you for being such a wonderful panel. Thank you for being here with us. Thank you for bringing your expertise and your local perspectives with that. I'm going to turn things over to Kristen to wrap us up. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jason, and many, many thanks to all of our speakers for your insights and your contributions, and special gratitude to you, Jason, for moderating 2 amazing discussions this afternoon. To our audience, in the weeks and months to come, we want to make sure that our findings are accessible to the broadest possible audience of public officials, policymakers, and change agents across the country. We are recording today's webinar. I saw a number of questions about whether or not we would share the slides. We are recording the webinar, and we will circulate the posting to all the attendees. But we are also happy to consider requests for follow-up briefings and presentations to help you dig even deeper into our study findings. Please send those requests to me, Kristen Harper, and we're posting in the chat a few email addresses just to help you find us. We are also happy to take your questions. We got many of them over the course of the webinar, and we'll be answering each of those after today's discussion. If you didn't have a chance to post them in the chat, or if you think of a question in coming days, please do feel free to reach out to our study authors. Again, all of our email addresses are in the chat. Thank you to all of you for joining us this afternoon. Please enjoy the rest of your day and the rest of your week.